Welcome back. Delighted to have you at panel 2. And we're going to take a little bit deeper dive on several of the issues that Senator Warner mentioned. And we'll start off with Professor John Mayo talking about telecom. Professor Mayo is Professor of Economic Business and Public Policy at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. He is an expert on the telecommunications industry. Deep in his past, he was chief economist of the U.S. Senate Small Business Committee. So not a foreigner to these parts. So Professor Mayo, please kick off panel 2.
Okay, Brad, thank you. Since you mentioned my past, it really actually is good to be back in the Senate Small Business Committee hearing room. It does bring back lots of memories. Today, the way I had teed this event up is that as we move from an election season to a governance season, we need to really focus on, or we might benefit, let's just say, by focusing on issues that center on what do we know? What do we actually know about an area? What can you go to the bank with? And what do we not know? So my talk, which is going to be centered over on the slides over there, so you'll have to look over there, and I may have to ask Danny to read it for me because it's a little farther away than my eyes will be able to see. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the issues of what do we know and what do we need to know. And Chairman Janikowski at the FCC yesterday could not have teed this up for me better. I actually did not see this quote until this morning. But in an announcement announcing a technology transition task force for the telecommunications industry, he said, in a broadband world, how can we best ensure our nation's communications policies continue to drive a virtuous cycle of innovation and investment, promote competition, and protect consumers? So that, as I said, was the question. That's what we need to know. Now, I'm going to reverse the order on just this slide and ask the question first. But I'm going to give you a little mnemonic I also dreamed up just this morning. And it is to establish a set of policies to maintain practical solutions. We need to promote a policy of PICIO. Has anybody heard of PICIO? I don't think so because I just made it up. All right, what is the mnemonic? The mnemonic, I think, is a set of, it's motivated by a set of economic metrics. To move away from ideology to say, how might we, in a very practical sense, look at things that matter? What matters? PICIO, price, investment, competition, innovation, and output. You know, let me just run through each of these and talk about what we know in these spaces and what we need to know. And I'm going to be very quick in doing this, and hopefully it'll tee up some discussion down the road. First, in terms of price, what do we know? Well, for the past decade, we know that wireless prices have dropped precipitously from about 20 cents a minute to under 5 cents a minute. We know that long-distance prices have plummeted to virtually zero at the margin. The price of making a long-distance call is effectively zero. And we know that the price per gigabyte of data transmitted has also fallen precipitously. Those are all good news things. What do we need to know? What do we need to know? We need to know, as Senator Warner indicated in very clear terms, we need to know something about the availability of spectrum in this country. We can give lip service to it, but if the reality is that we have an exploding demand, absolutely exploding demand for things wireless, whether it's notebooks or tablets or cell phones, it's an exploding demand. And the lifeblood, I think Senator Warner called it the coin of the realm, is spectrum. If we do not have an available spectrum policy to ensure availability of spectrum, the reality of the economic system is that prices will go up. And we need to understand something about the way the world is going to evolve in terms of pricing. Bundles seem to be all the rage. Are consumers going to continue to drive bundles? And if so, how might that later down the road affect something like the competitive environment? What about investment? What about investment in the telecom space? Well, here, the bottom line is it's been dramatically successful. If you look, and you'll just see the visual of an upward sloping chart here, this is a cumulative investment in the wireless industry over the last 15 years. It's been a period of dramatic growth. We now have spent $1/3 of $1 trillion in one sector, $1/3 of $1 trillion in one sector to promote investment in this area. If you break that down, that chart, by the way, oops, can I go back? Yes. That chart's a little deceptive because it's a cumulative chart. So what I did is I broke it down into a year-over-year basis. And what do we spend every year? Well, for the last decade, the wireless sector has spent between $20 and $25 billion of private sector investment to build out the infrastructure in this industry. That's a lot. And it's especially a lot when you'll see this next chart that those numbers have stayed steady in an incredibly weak economy in the 2008, 9, 10 period. You'll see the growth rate of investment is in red. Anything above the vertical axis or the horizontal axis is a positive number. Growth rates started out very, very high as we began the process of building out the infrastructure, but have consistently remained above the blue line, which is the level of growth, the growth rates for private sector investment in the whole U.S. Big success story. What's it led to? It's led to not just investment for its own sake, which of course creates jobs and so on, but there are very, very tangible benefits in this space. If you look at the number of cell sites that are positioned around this country, we're now at about 280,000 of them. And they don't just happen as a tower these days. They occur on top of water towers or at the top of schools or what have you. All right. What they do is they have dramatically increased our ability to make calls in places that we never could have made calls before. The number of the downtime, the dead zones that we have are dropping. And what that means is that consumers are gravitating more and more and more to the wireless space. So now we have dead zones in live communications, not on cell phones. Making progress. We good? Okay, so that was my point. The expanded cell sites have improved quality and reduced dead zones. All right, investment. What do we need to know? What do we need to know? Well, we need to know something about how investment is going to unfold as we transition to an all IP, all internet protocol world. The telecommunications grid was put in place as a set of copper wires that provide narrowband service. The future is not narrowband, the future is broadband. And how is investment going to unfold in that world? And are we going to invoke public policies that in some sense constrain the nature of investment to, in sort of what I would say is buggy whip style, require investment in buggy whips as opposed to letting companies pursue consumer interest of getting more and more broadband into the marketplace. Competition. What do we know? What do we know about competition in this space? Well, first, let me just say that we know competition is really important. Competition, I've spent the better part of my adult life studying competition. Competition is a powerful driver for all sorts of good things, for prices, for quality, for these other things that I've talked about, output and investment and so on. So competition is very important. We know, too, that the investments that are going to happen in this industry are massive. We've seen that already. Those massive investments, as a just pure matter of economics, are likely to limit the number of players. What happens when you limit the number of players? Well, it turns out, we know, this is something we know from the economics domain, is that competition can happen in relatively small number of markets. Is it guaranteed? No, it's not guaranteed, but it can happen. How's it worked out so far? How it's worked out so far is pretty darn well. As I said, prices have fallen substantially. You've got very, very high consumer churn rates in the wireless space. You've got lots of choices. I'll mention that on the next slide. And there's been a lot of competition in the broadband space, and more as wireless broadband becomes substitutable, especially for anybody under the age of 35, for wireline broadband. Here's a picture. Just look at the blue, the giant Pac-Man there, I guess. That's the share of American consumers who have a choice of 5 or more wireless carriers in this country. Right now, customer choice is good. What do we need to know about competition? What we need to know is, will it continue? Will we be able to continue to bank on this virtuous cycle of competition creating benefits for consumers? It's not clear. We need a vigorous and vigilant antitrust authority and authorities to keep their eye on the ball. Right now, it's working pretty darn well, but we've got an antitrust backstop that needs to be vigilant in the event that it's not. Innovation, what do we know? What do we know about innovation? Well, we know that the convergence of various technologies that have brought together data, voice, and video have dramatically changed the industry. No longer do you have siloed worlds of voice, of video, and of data. They all occur seamlessly over your smartphones. We have a lot of change that has happened by way of how people communicate. Every indication is that it will continue. This particular chart, and I won't go through it in detail, shows, and it's a really nice visual. These slides will be posted on our center website later. Shows the dramatic expansion as we move from 1G to 2G, 3G, and 4G. We now have 101 million smartphones in this country. Remember, smartphones really, you think they've been around forever? Call it 2007, guys. 111 million of these things now in place. 20 million wireless tablets and laptops. So the technology and innovation have really changed. What do we need to know? We need to know the direction of innovation. At least as an academic, I'm very curious about it. But as a practical matter, what can we do? We have to invoke, or we ought to invoke, I believe, technology-neutral innovation policies that allow the technology that consumers want and firms can then supply to work, not to handicap one particular technology, whether it's cable telephony, wireline telephony, or wireless. Output, final thing I want to talk about. What do we know? Output has grown dramatically, and there have been dramatic changes in the composition of output. Here's the number of wireless cell phones over time. We now have 330 million active subscribing customers of wireline. Yes, that's more than the United States population. The blue line here shows the number of wireless subscribers, which is now over three times the number of wireline subscribers we have in this country. Output, what do we need to know? Is that output growth sustainable? Let me come back to something Senator Warner said. We've got to enable this growth. And we've got to enhance spectrum supply, and we've got to encourage forward-looking investments rather than looking in hindsight. Now, I won't go into this in detail because we're a little time constrained. I would encourage you to take a look at a working paper, recent working paper by Robert Gordon, a brilliant economist at Northwestern, who wrote that he's very pessimistic about economic growth, and he suggests that the innovations that have happened in telecom and internet space have done nothing more than to create ways for us to use leisure time and to be entertained. I'm much more optimistic about the productivity enhancing features of these technologies. And let me just say that I think in terms of economic growth, we have lots of opportunity for that growth. Think of broadband and wireless as a lubricant. It's a lubricant that brings society's knowledge to us as consumers and to us as individual firms. So let me avoid any discussion of that equation up there. You can ask me about that later. Thank you very much.
So I think we have time for a few questions for Professor Mayo. Yes.
Hi there. My name is Sonia. I lead innovation in management teaching. And I was recently in South Korea for some business meetings. And one of the things that struck me was how I think the stat is connectivity, and when you're, you hear the stat and it's wow, but when you're there, you see how it influences consumer behavior and economic growth. So, I come back to the US and finding Wi-Fi, I gotta run into a Starbucks, and so I guess the question is, we've got the technology, we've got the skill to do this. How do we encourage the will to make it happen? Because as you illustrated, this is the future. How do we propel that and bring on that momentum?
Right, that's a great question. It's the $64,000 question. And I guess what I was trying to suggest by the set of slides that I offered was that this is unfolding very, very rapidly. As I mentioned, smartphones really are a phenomenon only since 2007. It's happening very, very rapidly. And if you go back, take your example of Starbucks. 4 years ago, Starbucks didn't have Wi-Fi hotspots. Nobody had Wi-Fi hotspots. They're coming around the country at a dramatic pace. We have a different set of challenges in the US than you have in Korea and other more densely populated areas, because we're a very, very big country. So there's going to be some challenges, especially in rural areas. But in terms of policies that encourage this, we've got to think about creating opportunities, every opportunity for firms to invest profitably to try and sort of secure customers' businesses and to encourage competition among them. It's a great way to, I think, continue that pace. Danny?
John, if I could just add some thoughts that will flow your service on the comment committee.
Please.
What you're saying. I want to add some caveats to the information you laid out. I would discuss wireless and wired as separate markets, and I understand that there's some degree of competition between the two markets, but to some degree it's a comparison of apples and oranges. There's nowhere in America where you get 4 to 6 wires coming into your house with wired broadband being delivered over them. You get that in the wireless market, and the capabilities of the technologies are vastly different. That aside, I think there's 2 points that are missing from your slide. One is resiliency, and the other is access. First, on resiliency, the fact that your wired telephone works 99.999% of the time, and that it has to work whether or not there's a natural disaster. None of that applies to either cable broadband or to a wireless telephone. The people who just went through the Sandy hurricane saw that. There's a very vital role for government in ensuring that networks meet basic standards. And the second is access. Well over 95% of Americans have access to a telephone that works just as well whether you're in South Dakota or if you're in West Virginia, to take 2 random states. So going forward, that those performance standards that we require of a telephone and affordability and ubiquity standards that we require of a telephone, we have not imposed on cable, we have not imposed on wireless, and the markets reflect that, right? You don't get good wireless service in South Dakota. You're never gonna. I mean, the economies of scale don't work to do so unless you force some sort of cross-subsidization, you force some sort of investment, right? So at the end of the day, what I would say is that yes, there are strong and good lessons to be drawn from the light touch regulatory approach to the wireless market. But you have to understand that if you make the whole world apply, the whole telecom sector work that way, you will have all the costs as well as the benefits of the wireless market as it's today. It will not be resilient, it will not be accessible to every American, it will not by definition be affordable. And those are serious social and political problems.
Okay, longer discussion, but what you raise is, at the outset, is something that empirically is something that I would put in the category of things we know, and it sounds like you might put them in the category of things we know too, but maybe we ought to just both think maybe there are things that we need to know, and that is wireless and wireline technologies substitutes, or are they separate? Because if they really do compete in the same market, if consumers use wireless as a substitute for wireline vigorously and respond to higher prices in wireline by shifting to wireless or vice versa, then they wind up being substitutes, not separate in separate spheres. And it's empirical. It's absolutely. It's an empirical question. I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that consumers are using wireline and wireless as substitute in a narrowband context. Then we move to your next question, which is whether it would work in broadband. And there too, I would say that not as a matter of ideology, but as a matter of just raw economic, practical sort of investigations, it's an empirical question. A lot of people sitting in this room right now use their smartphone for their primary, if not exclusive, access to broadband.
At home.
Wherever they are, wherever they are. It's a longer conversation. That ultimately, that's what I'm saying is let's let consumers move that way, and I think you don't disagree with that at all. But what you're suggesting is that, gosh, we need to protect people in South Dakota and make sure that there's a quality and a standard there. And you and I don't disagree. No one would disagree. The question is, do we want to tie it to a copper line wired network, or do we want to look at forward-looking, innovative ways to get that job done? They may not be able to get cell phone service in South Dakota. I've skied the entire Vail Mountain in Colorado in the middle of nowhere and had cell service everywhere. My guess is you and I can go to South Dakota and find some places that we get cell service. Okay,
well, it is
I know.
a longer discussion.
All right.
But I think that if we can get from industry an agreement that they are willing to comply with some basic social contract that applies to an IP network, then we could see movement towards a regulatory structure that allows for a lighter touch relative to copper.
And you and I completely agree on that. I think that's the discussion that we're going to have over the next year and a half. So that's a very good point.
And I think this conversation is great. I'm sorry to cut it off. I'm sorry we're not going to have any more questions. Be aware that, think of this as a teaser, right? There will be more events on these various topics that the center will host going forward. So we'll look forward to extended conversation going forward.
Hopefully social issues will be included in the economic discussion, because I think there's some convergence there as well. And I take strong exception to this meaning that social issues are somehow ideological. I take strong exception to that.
Okay, thank you. So now I think we'll move on to innovation, and Dr. Carol Corrado will be our next speaker. Dr. Corrado is Senior Advisor and Research Director in Economics at the Conference Board. She has done seminal work on measuring intangible capital and investigating its relationship with economic growth. Prior to moving to the Conference Board, she was Chief of the Industrial Output Section at the Federal Reserve Board, where she managed a research program that looked at the relationship between innovation and growth. So, Carol?
Thank you, Brad. Well, it gives me great pleasure to be here today. I hope you've enjoyed my colleagues' comments, and it's wonderful how the remarks of Senator Warner were a great prelude to what everybody said. I'm going to be talking on the topic of innovation policy. Whoops, not that way, this way, yes. So everybody seems to think that the U.S. needs more innovation. I just sort of realized, like over the weekend, there was a editorial in the Financial Times saying that the U.S. was actually great at innovation, and why didn't Europe sort of look toward it a little bit more? I got an email from a family member circulating an article about 6 strategies to improve innovation in a firm. Somebody forwarded me a blog post about 5 myths about innovation. There are a profusion of metrics, a profusion of rankings, and think tanks all over the place sort of competing to offer the best solutions or the best sort of program to go forward. So it's a great topic for, as you know, John sort of was talking about the purpose of us being here today. What do we know, and what do we need to know? I think we need to ask at least 4 questions. I actually, in thinking about it, might add a 5th to it. What is innovation? Much less innovation policy. This is something that has sort of grown, I would say, over the last 10 years to be something that policymakers actually talk about. How is innovation measured? What factors have shaped the past success of the U.S.? The U.S. is regarded as obviously being the most innovative country on the face of the earth. The concern is that we're losing that competitive edge. But then, you know, having studied those factors, what's going to be important, you know, looking forward, and moreover, again, the question I should have added to this, and what of those factors are under the control or within the federal realm? There's much that policymakers, you know, can't influence. I can't go over all these topics in 10 minutes. There is a very nice recent report by the administration. You can find it on the webpage of the Department of Commerce, Economics and Statistics Administration. And it really follows on an agenda that the previous administration set out to say, let's define innovation, let's think about how we can measure it, and then out of that progress towards a set of policies or actions that we in the federal realm can do something about. So this is very nonpartisan as an issue. So what am I going to do? Like I said, I can't review all of this, but I'm going to try to provide some context. So if any of you, you know, come across, you know, all these competing ideas or are working on something that somebody says, well, you know, this is really important to promote innovation in the United States, maybe you'll have a better sense of sort of where it all comes from. Innovation defined. Again, an advisory committee to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce in the previous administration concluded that innovation was a process whereby organizations put something new to commercial and financial gain. It's about, you know, making money, or increasing scale, or increasing the effectiveness of an organization. Usually it is in the business context that this is discussed, and that's why the word commercial and financial is used. And note that innovation encompasses but is more than research and development. You come across a lot of reports that equate innovation with science, you know, and advance in science, but it encompasses that, but it is much more. And that's because innovations can be technological or non-technological. We think of Apple and its great innovation success. It was part technological and part design, thinking about what a customer wants, and great marketing. So there's two approaches to measuring innovation, and one uses indicators. And sometimes it's a single indicator, like scientific patents. Sometimes people add together a bunch of indicators, and that's how you get these rankings that you see all over the place. But the point is, there is no agreed upon method that's grounded in economics that tells you what to choose or how to weight any particular indicator. I mean, that's what the word indicator means. It means you think it's indicative of something that you care about. The other approach, you know, tries to get to the heart of the matter, but is necessarily then more abstract, and is grounded in economic theory, and basically what it involves is calculating productivity. And that's output net of inputs. That's very important. A lot of these indicators blend inputs to innovation along with outcomes of innovation, and you don't really know necessarily what you're looking at. What's the problem with the productivity measures that economists like to use? Well, it's very demanding in terms of data, and you know, can be inaccurate. So I'm going to, because the productivity measures give you, an easy way to summarize what the state of innovation in the United States is. That's what I'm going to give you a picture of. But mind you, I'm not overlooking the indicators, and some of them are very scary, and it really is out of the scariness of some of those, that we have all this concern about innovation in the economy today. Again, you can look at this Commerce report. They have a lot of the pictures in there. Senator Warner referred to two of my favorite. It was really interesting that he singled them out. One is the business startup rate. He told you about how startups are so important in generating jobs. Well, the problem is the business startup rate is down. Now, we have a recession, but you're always going to ask, are the innovative processes of the United States grinding to a halt, or is it just the recession? It's hard to tell. The other thing he mentioned, again, I worked at the Federal Reserve for a long time, this is very important, is the flow of capital to business. Now, you should expect the flow of capital to change forms. I mean, we have our big investment banks today. They grew out of a need for the railroads to obtain financing to proceed in their westward expansion across the United States. Venture capital is grew up. A lot of people made a lot of money in IT and then turned around and became venture capitalists. They knew the industry and they thought they could pick them. Pharma doesn't really work that way. You have to have too much specialized knowledge. Really the seed capital for pharma really comes from a startup, often being funded by government R&D, being successful, and then they're bought up by big pharma. Big pharma knows what little pharma is doing because that's their business, and they understand how to pick them. Venture capitalists have a lot of trouble, and they're not patient enough because it takes like 9 to 10 years to come to fruition. So the other thing that's down are IPOs, just the rate at which firms go public, and there's some structural issues there. The Treasury has recently issued a report on that, very influential. Anyway, those are the scary things, but I'm not like Bob Gordon. When I look at productivity, I see some bright signs, so let me share them with you. First of all, why do people get scared? They really get scared because advanced economies are facing a challenge right now. So let's take the simplest measure of productivity, which is output per worker. Well, advanced economies lost their edge in terms of the growth of output per worker 15 years ago. So let's, forget about that. The challenge of productivity leadership really should be thought of in terms of levels. So, you don't want to compare the growth rate of R&D in China with the growth rate of R&D in the United States. That makes no sense. They obviously have to grow very fast if they want to raise their standards of living to higher levels. So the U.S. productivity level is the highest for all large economies, and it's about 4 times the average global level. So if you think of the U.S. as being 100, the rest of the globe on average is 25. The Euro area productivity per worker is about 25% below the U.S. That's actually a big number. And Japan's is about 30. That's because the Euro area has bright spots and not so bright spots. But so does the U.S., by the way. So we just don't think of it that way. And in China, the gap is 85% of the U.S. In India, it's 90%. So 85, that's again, if the U.S. is 100, China's 15, a factor of 6. So again, the power of compound arithmetic, just think about it. If our productivity, so let's say the Euro area productivity grew 1% faster than the United States, after 25 years, that gap would close. Well, that's not going to happen. Japan and Euro area have not done so well recently, and the U.S. has. Senator Warner told you that. In China, let's see, China output per hour has grown 8.5% since 1990, when the beginning of reform. That's 6.75 percentage points greater than the U.S. Were that gap to be maintained, and many people believe it will not, it would, then the gap between the U.S. and China would close in about 25 years, but that's what it would take. So the leadership role of the United States is pretty solid, but people are catching up, and part of it's just inevitable. So those are the numbers. Now, what about the US experience. What I've plotted here, the two side-by-side bars, are GDP per capita, an accepted method of gauging living standards, and labor productivity, which is GDP per hour. One of the reasons why we're interested in productivity is it's a good measure of living standards. If you notice, labor productivity, GDP per capita, about the same thing. That's because when you average over a long period of time, you know, the labor utilization sort of stays the same because we're an advanced economy. So the two sort of mirror each other, and that's why we like to look at labor productivity. Now, multi-factor productivity, the side-by-side bars on the left or the right, aren't, you know, take into account the inputs, other inputs, as well as improvements in labor quality. And this is why everybody's so fascinated with innovation and why they want to promote innovation. Note that the innovation accounts for at least half of the growth in overall labor productivity or half of the growth in our labor standards. It's really important. So, you know, you can either duplicate your, you know, you can grow by duplicating your inputs. And that's a perfectly respectable way to grow in some cases. Or you can work smarter, hire, you know, buy better machines, hire better workers, and grow through innovation. Now, I've just plotted these two 30-year periods. You might think I'm, particularly if you read Bob Gordon's paper, that I'm averaging in the last period a slow, long decline on the part of the United States. No, that's not true. If I break the last 30-year period into the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the rate of innovation is about the same. If you wanted to put a fine hair to it, you'd say it's gone up. But what about since the recession? This is what we have. Now again, I'm plotting two 30-year periods next to a 5-year period. That red bar, you know, only is 5 years and isn't comparable. But this is where we stand. Our problems are the macroeconomic problems of labor utilization that Rob addressed. Our problem is not, you know, the reason why U.S. living standards haven't advanced in this broad sense is not because productivity has slowed. It's because we had a recession and we have a lot of people still out of work, and we've got to work real hard to get those people back in the labor force. That's what the meaning of the distinction between GDP per capita and GDP per hour work. And also, innovation hasn't ground to a halt. We're in the middle of the recession, and the rate that has been posted for the last 5 years is pretty good. So that is, I think I want to make one other point before I leave this chart. I'm graphing here the total economy. I think it's important. Again, think back to a couple of the points that Senator Warner made. And he talked about the possibilities in health IT and the possibilities of reforming education and making it a lot more efficient using IT solutions. One of the things that economists tend to do is just look at business sector productivity to gauge the health of the economy. I'm throwing everything in here because I think one of the greatest opportunities is in the area of health and education, which is usually left out of the picture of productivity. A noted healthcare economist has estimated that there's something like $700 billion worth of waste. Not talking about the quality of healthcare or longevity or all the good things about investments in healthcare, but just waste in the system. That's 5% of GDP. So it's just suppose 10% of that gets whittled away over the next 5 years. You know, you've got 2/10 on productivity. Well, I mean, 2/10 is a big deal. Those are some of the differences between those bars. So I think we need to look at the total economy. We need to look at the broader service sectors that aren't, totally driven by market forces. And it's the only way to sort of put the demographic challenges that we have in front of us in context. So, so if you think some of these numbers are small, it's because I've added in government, I've added in health, I've added in education. But all it does is reduce the size of the bars. It doesn't really change the picture. So what are growth strategies based upon this sort of this context that I've tried to put out for you rather than listing a bunch of indicators? I mean, first of all, I did point out that you can promote growth through innovation, or you can promote growth through improving utilization or duplication. I mean, they're all respectable if it ends up improving living standards. But we look to innovation for a number of reasons. That tends to be the biggest bang for the buck. So we have two options. Private industry pushes out the production frontier. Some of that is what John was just talking about in the case of telecom. And the 21st century innovation is going to be based upon knowledge-based, or what I've called intangible capital. But what do I mean by this? It means the development of intellectual property rights, the protection of them, and making markets in them. It means exploiting computerized information in new and novel ways. Everybody's talking about big data. It involves design. That's non-scientific, okay? Just better solutions for better lives kind of a thing. Marketing, branding. The United States is still, on the top list of 100 brands in the globe. The United States still owns most of them. You can make money off of brands, and that rewards, and that shows up as productivity. And organizational structure. The United States businesses still rank the highest in terms of their use and smart use of IT, and they got to keep on getting better at that in order to stack up in a global world. The case for public investment is made very well in the Department of Commerce report, and this involves continued investments in R&D, particularly in defense as well as non-defense. That distinction is not drawn well in the Commerce report, because I think they were just naturally orienting themselves to a non-defense sort of audience or non-defense applications. But there's a lot of influential work that is just starting to come out that pinpoints the origin of some of the unique contributions that U.S. industry has made to essentially to DARPA, the defense think tank that developed a lot of computer technology, essentially. John has talked to you about the importance of broadband and wireless, and the government also needs to think if it has to provide infrastructure for the new frontiers. I think there's a slight sort of typo there. When I talked about the challenge of big data, which is coming, I say it needs supercomputing. It needs supercomputers, okay, is what I meant to say there. And again, some of this stuff is happening. The National Laboratory System, each of which has a major supercomputer, is opening up parts of those facilities for small business to use in some cases. And that's a big deal, because the product design and any big data applications usually requires a supercomputer to work with, and small business doesn't have access to supercomputers, and there's a role for the government in this area. I've written on this elsewhere, and I think it's an important point. And finally, there is the old strategic duplication. I think that one of the things that people don't think enough of, and this is not necessarily a federal government issue, but there are like it came out in the discussion of telecom, we have vast parts of the United States that are not very densely populated. That may not be the case in the next 25 years. I think most people think that a lot of the small cities that are in the interior of this country are, each one of them has an opportunity to be in what they call an innovation cluster, which is grow because they have a particular company that then nurtures all the services around it, or they have a university. And there's a lot of the underpopulated areas of this country could be developed without necessarily innovating, but just by copying some of the strategies that have made particularly the cities on the coast in Chicago, the innovation centers that they are today. So I just want to remind everybody, it's not just all about pushing out the frontier. It's also about diffusion of existing ideas and applying it. And the United States has more underutilized resources than I think people realize. So thank you.
So, thank you, Carol, for a rich discussion. I'm sure there are questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to put those on hold and move directly to the energy part of the program, where Professor Catherine Wolfram, who's a professor of business administration at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley and co-director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Innovation at Berkeley. Catherine has done a lot of work on energy markets and also energy and its role in development. Prior to moving to Berkeley, she was a professor at Harvard. So,
great, thanks. And thanks to all of you for sticking around. Senator Warner led by talking about energy policy, and I'll finish by talking about energy policy. I really wanted to highlight 3 trends that I think are going to shape energy policy decisions and energy policy choices that we have going forward. And okay, how do I do? There. So those are the demand growth for energy in the developing world, and as we become a global economy, as things like coal and natural gas join oil as globally traded commodities, the demand growth in the developing world is really going to shape policy choices that we have here in the U.S. I also want to highlight shale gas. We've all experienced it here in the U.S., but I want to talk a bit about the potential for shale gas abroad. And finally, I think this is more a hope of mine rather than really a predictive trend, but I do want to talk a bit about carbon taxes, something that's importantly at the intersection of fiscal policy discussions and energy policy discussions. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this. I'm tempted to hit that light switch, but I'm afraid that I'll send the whole room into darkness. This is a picture of the world at night, and it really is kind of a way to summarize how electricity in this case, and more broadly, energy is used around the world. So if you take the US-centric view, and let me indulge and be very California-centric, you can say this shows you where people live, right? If you look at California, you can really see San Francisco and LA kind of highlighted there in relief. And then you can see that not so many people live in the Rocky Mountains, and oh yeah, there's the eastern seaboard. You can kind of see the big cities there, in Europe, India, the rest of the world. Well, that's the US-centric view of the world. This is a representation of where people actually live. And so I think we often forget we're the biggest economy in the world, but we are not the biggest in terms of population. India and China have nearly 3 billion people. And so you look in northern India there's just incredible population density, many people living. If you superimpose the energy use map over the population map, you see that there are many, many people in northern India, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, in China, where people really don't have now access to electricity or access to energy. But that all is in the process of changing. And there's just going to be tremendous growth. You see sub-Saharan Africa there. Sub-Saharan Africa now uses as much electricity as New York. So just with much, much more population. So there's just a scope for incredible growth and demand in energy in the developing world. And as I say, that's going to shape prices for these global commodities like natural gas more and more, and oil. It already has affected the tremendous growth in energy in China throughout 2000, arguably was a large factor in driving oil prices higher. So I'm trying to do this in pictures, but let me just highlight a couple statistics that emphasize that this demand growth is really happening. And in particular, I'm doing research that shows that it really matters where we're seeing people coming out of poverty and entering the middle class, because people become first-time owners of vehicles, of air conditioners, of refrigerators, and that's just driving this kind of tremendous growth in energy demand. So for instance, car ownership in China is growing at 25% a year. Nothing grows at 25% a year. The beauties of compounding mean that if something's growing at 25% a year, it doubles every 3 years. So that's just incredibly high growth in car ownership in China. And going with that is growth in demand for oil. The number of air conditioners sold in India is growing at 20% per year. And if you've been to the big cities, the big hot, humid cities in the developing world, you'll see just these kind of walls or the building faces covered with air conditioning units. That's partly what's happening in India. Similar statistic, in 1995, 1 in 3 households in urban Shanghai owned an air conditioner. By 2009, there are 2 air conditioners, because they're not central air conditioners, they're these window units, as I'm saying. By 2009, there were 2 per household. So again, just tremendous growth in these energy-using assets. So going along with that, I wanted to highlight what's happened with shale gas. And here are, someone's plotted the predictions. You probably can't see the legend there, but let me emphasize what's going on. These are the EIA's projections for what would happen to gas prices, natural gas prices, over the 30-year out period. So the top 2 lines, there's one that's kind of a blue straight line, and then the other one that's through circles. Those were 2007, and I forget what it is. I think it was 2007 and 2008 projections. Nobody saw shale gas coming, basically. They were just projecting we use the existing gas reserves, prices would rise, and then you see that orange line dropping, that's shale gas. So shale gas, represented here through prices, shale gas has transformed the natural gas industry. It's been an incredible technological innovation. That was the EIA's forecast, down to something like 350 per MMBTU. In fact, shale gas prices bottomed out below $2 an MMBTU. So it's really been transformative in the United States. It's much lower carbon intensity, about half the carbon intensity of coal, and so our greenhouse gas emissions have actually fallen as we've transitioned more to this cheap gas. But tying back to the first trend I mentioned, the growth in energy demand in the developing world, I wanted to emphasize that right now the U.S. is experiencing this, but there are shale gas reserves, recoverable shale gas reserves in the rest of the world also. So you can't see it from the picture. This is just kind of showing you where the reserves are. It says nothing about size, but China has almost 1.5 times as much recoverable shale gas as the United States. They have not yet tapped that. So I know there are currently policy discussions about exporting our natural gas and building LNG terminals, but I think this really gets back to the issue that Brad brought up. What we really want to do is export technology, export the know-how, and help China access those shale gas reserves so that meeting this demand for air conditioning, for refrigeration, that they're seeing as people come into the middle class can be done with gas and not with coal. It's not going to solve the climate problems, but it's definitely going to buy us time. As I said, coal is about twice as carbon intensive as natural gas. So if China can meet its 5-year out growth in energy demand with natural gas, and as opposed to coal, this is tremendous savings in greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is a carbon tax, and I'm trying to do this with pictures. Here, the biggest picture I'd like to have you take away is the idea that reasonable calculations suggest that a carbon tax of less than $20 a ton of CO2 would yield $100 billion in revenue. could solve, you know, a quarter of the financial problem. And less than $20 is a low carbon tax. It's, you know, maybe 16 cents a gallon in terms of gas prices, you know, less than a cent a kilowatt hour in terms of electricity prices. And it's also less than what the federal government has determined is the social cost of carbon, less than the cost of the externalities created by using this carbon. As I said, this is at the intersection of energy policy and fiscal policy. Let me highlight the fiscal policy implications. Economists agree that labor, taxes on labor, income taxes, payroll taxes, and taxes on capital are distortionary. They distort decisions that people make. If you tax capital, people will invest less capital. A tax on carbon, something that we've decided is creating bad things for the economy, is better. So if we shift, you know, if we use some of this $100 billion in revenue from taxing carbon to reduce corporate taxes, reduce income taxes, then the economy will grow. This is a positive, you know, this is a boon for macroeconomic growth. From a climate policy perspective, I know that a lot of economists share my frustration with things like Doha. With these big, you know, attempts to get everyone under one tent and have some kind of global cap and trade arrangement. So Doha, we've reinstated the Kyoto Protocol. That covers something like 17% of global emissions. Because as I've shown, China and India, the BRIC, are really where the growth in energy demand is gonna be. So I think, you know, a tax on carbon, if we raise a lot of money, that means that people are still emitting the carbon, and maybe that's not, you know, from an environmental perspective, it's not the best thing. But my own personal view is that the only way to solve climate change is through innovation. And so if we can devote, you know, some share of that $100 billion to like basic research and development on new solar technologies, or, you know, whatever the innovative community decides is the right way to address climate change, then that's the way to go. So I think, you know, for the short term, that the real benefit of a carbon tax is the fiscal policy implications. And I hope that this is predictive, but again, I think this is less of a trend than a hope. Thank you.
So we're over, but I'm sure a couple people must have questions. So take 5 minutes for questions on either the innovation talk or the energy portion.
Awesome.
Yes.
To what extent are renewables part of our 21st century energy solution? And going off of that, to what extent is shale gas an answer to climate change concerns and energy independence concerns? I think a lot of the talk about why increasing domestic production is not a good solution is because we're not insulated from price fluctuations. So I thought that picture about all these supplies of shale gas all over the world tell a similar story. Like, one day we're not going to be this big player in the shale gas production world. We're going to be in a global market again. So just wanted to address those points.
So there's a lot wrapped up in that question. I think if you really believe the climate scientists, then we can't use all the shale gas that we know is there, and we can't use all the oil that we know is there. So I think, you know, we'll never get to the world that you're envisioning, where, you know, the U.S. has used all its shale gas, and we're relying on Qatar or something for shale gas, if we're really serious about addressing the climate issues. And I think renewables have to be part of the solution. We have to kind of wean ourselves off fossil fuels. Renewables now are expensive. Solar power is expensive. It's also got the issue that you can't produce solar power when the sun's not shining. You can't produce wind power when the wind's not operating. So this is wrapped up with storage technologies. But, you know, there needs to be some innovation there. There needs to be price competitive solar power. China and India are growing. They don't, you know, somebody once pointed out to me that you can't tell a man who's got a 24-inch waist and has been malnourished not to eat a cheeseburger because it's got too much cholesterol, and that's kind of what it's like telling China and India to use expensive power. They want to develop, they want to grow, and we need to come up with renewable technologies that can allow them to do that and not emit as much carbon.
Yes.
Why use a method like hydraulic fracturing, which has like obvious externalities, instead of going to renewable energy? Would that be because of the cost of investing?
Yeah, and I think, so you're raising the externalities associated with hydraulic fracking, and those are, I think those are potentially very real, but I think what we need to do is make the companies assume those assume that those potential liabilities, make them put up big bonds, for instance, before they start doing the fracking, and also just impose regulations and make sure that they're doing it. As I've heard it, the real externalities from fracking are not fracking itself, but like bad fracking or poorly managed fracking. So I think that right now it's a really cheap, very abundant in the U.S. energy source, and so it's it's very tempting to access that. Right now, renewables are expensive, and that's where innovation comes in. I think we need innovation to drive down the cost of renewables.
One more? Yes.
I just want to make sure I understood you right. Are you saying that the best way for policymakers to address the issues of our environmental or our energy use is to fund innovation? That's the best thing that we can do at this point?
Yeah, I mean, because right now we don't have technologies that can let us consume the energy we want to consume and not create disastrous climate change.
Okay. John?
So before we turn you loose, let me just say thank you all very, very much for your time and attention today. It was, from my perspective, just marvelous to have Senator Warner with us and to be able to follow up in each of these areas, in macroeconomy and international trade, in energy and environment, in innovation, telecommunications. All we could do is sort of stick our toe in the water today. And each one of these areas, it will be the intent of the Georgetown Center to take a deeper dive on these issues as we go forward. Stay tuned for that. We hope you can participate in those. The deeper dives begin actually on this Friday with an event that's in your agenda, if you'll take a look at it, on taxation in the wireless industry. And then next week we'll have an event on trade issues that came out, international trade issues in telecommunications and the internet that come out of the Dubai conference, the WICET conference. So please do stay tuned for those. You're more than welcome. We'll always feed you and bring your intellect and please contribute. Thank you.